On a quiet afternoon in a small suburban park, a group of teenage boys gathered near the playground. Their laughter echoed through the air, but it wasn't the sound of innocent fun. These boys, filled with arrogance and misplaced confidence, had spent their summer days finding amusement in tormenting others, particularly those they viewed as easy targets. Today, their sights were set on an elderly black man who sat calmly on a nearby bench, reading a weathered book. The man, Kane, was dressed simply. Plain shirt, worn jeans, and an old hat pulled low over his face. To the boys, he looked like just another vulnerable easy mark. They exchanged looks and smirks, their intentions clear. One of them, a taller boy with a cocky swagger, nudged his friends. "Look at that old guy," he sneered. "Bet he can't even walk straight, let alone defend himself. Probably too old to know what's going on." The group chuckled, and with a few more whispers and taunts, they approached Kane, circling him like wolves sizing up their prey. The man didn't seem to notice at first, or perhaps he simply chose not to react. His eyes remained fixed on his book, completely undisturbed by the growing commotion around him. One of the boys leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey, old man, what are you reading? Or can you even read at all?" Another boy chimed in. "Yeah, shouldn't you be somewhere else? Like, I don't know, back where you came from?" The remarks were harsh and pointed, their intent clear. But Kane remained silent, his fingers gently turning the pages of his book. This only seemed to fuel the boys' cruelty as their taunts grew louder, bolder. "Don't ignore us, old man. You think you're better than us?" One of them jeered, stepping closer. He puffed out his chest, trying to seem bigger and more intimidating. Still, Kane didn't respond. His calm demeanor, his silence, it was as if he didn't even acknowledge their existence, and that infuriated the group even more. One of the boys, perhaps the boldest of the bunch, stepped right in front of Kane, blocking his view. The others fell silent, watching intently as their leader took control of the situation. "Come on, old man. You think you're too good for us?" the boy said, his voice laced with aggression. "Why don't you show us some respect?" Then, without warning, the boy raised his hand as if to strike Kane. But before he could make contact, Kane's hand shot up like lightning, gripping the boy's wrist with a strength no one expected. The boy froze, his arm held in midair, unable to move. The other teens stood in stunned silence, their smirks fading as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Kane slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking with the boys. His expression was calm but firm. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet authority that made the boy's heart race with fear. At that moment, an elderly man walking his dog nearby stopped in his tracks. His eyes widened as he recognized Kane, his heart skipping a beat as memories flooded back. Without a second thought, he hurried over, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Wait! Stop! Don't you boys know who this man is?" the old man shouted, waving his arms to get their attention. The teens turned to look at him, confused and nervous. The boy, whose hand was still held by Kane, began to tremble. "This is Kane," the old man continued, his voice filled with both awe and respect. "Kane was a master martial artist, one of the best. I trained under him years ago. He's a former karate champion. He could wipe the floor with all of you in seconds if he wanted to." The group of teens stood there, speechless, their faces turning pale as the old man's words sank in. They looked at Kane with a newfound respect and fear. The boy, whose wrist Kane held, stammered, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Kane, still holding the boy's wrist, looked at him with a small, knowing smile. "You didn't know," he said softly, finally releasing the boy's hand. "That's the problem. You acted without thinking, without understanding. That's how people get hurt." The boys, still stunned, stepped back. Their bravado was completely gone. The arrogance they had walked in with had vanished, replaced by the dawning realization of their mistake. They had picked a fight they couldn't win. But worse than that, they had acted out of ignorance and prejudice. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Cain remained as calm and composed as ever. "I could have defended myself easily," Cain said, his voice low but filled with authority. "But I didn't. Because what would that have solved? Hurting you wouldn't teach you anything." He looked at each of the boys in turn, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "You see, strength isn't about being able to hurt someone. It's about knowing when not to. It's about using what you have to protect, to guide, to teach. I could have taught you a lesson you wouldn't forget with my fists, but that's not the kind of lesson you need." The boys remained silent, hanging on every word. The tension in the air had shifted, replaced by something heavier: shame, guilt, and an undeniable sense of humility. Cain paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "You boys think it's fun, don't you? Picking on people you think are weaker than you, but you don't know their stories. You don't know who they are or what they've been through. Racism, prejudice. These things come from ignorance, from not taking the time to understand another person." He looked at the boy who had raised his hand to strike him, his eyes softening. "You're young. You've got time to change, but if you keep living with hate in your heart, it'll only destroy you in the end." The boy's head hung low, and he nodded slowly. The old man who had recognized Cain stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "Boys, you have no idea how lucky you are that he didn't react the way you expected him to. Cain isn't just a fighter. He's a man of honor. A man who believes in teaching, not punishing." Cain turned to the old man and gave him a respectful nod, then looked back at the boys. "You're young, like I said, and I'm willing to forgive you. But you need to learn from this. Don't judge people by their looks or the color of their skin. Take the time to understand them. Everyone has a story, and you'll never know it if you don't open your eyes and your heart." The boys stood there, no longer full of swagger or arrogance. They were humbled in a way they hadn't expected. One of them, his voice shaky, finally spoke. "We're sorry. We didn't know." Cain smiled faintly, his expression softening even more. "That's the thing about life. You can't always know everything, but you can choose how you treat others, and that choice makes all the difference." With that, Cain turned and picked up his book once again, the peaceful old man sitting on a park bench. But the boys would never see him the same way again. They had come looking for a victim and found a teacher instead. And that lesson, the lesson of respect, humility, and the futility of hate, was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As they walked away, the old man who had recognized Cain patted the boys on the shoulder. "You learned something important today. Don't forget it." The boys nodded, their heads still spinning from the experience. They had set out to bully a stranger, but instead, they had learned a lesson in humility, one they would never forget. And Cain? He returned to his book, a small smile on his face. He had always believed in teaching through kindness and wisdom, not violence. Today had been no different, and as the sun began to set over the park, Cain knew that the seeds of change had been planted in the hearts of those boys. 4 weeks had passed since that life-altering day at the park, and the teenage boys, once filled with arrogance and youthful ignorance, had transformed in ways they never imagined. The encounter with Cain had left a profound mark on their lives. They had started seeing the world through a different lens, one of respect, understanding, and humility. Gone were the days of aimless bullying and mindless cruelty. The boys now carried a sense of responsibility for their actions, and it showed in how they treated others around them. One afternoon, by sheer coincidence, the same group of boys found themselves back in the park, walking along the familiar paths. Their conversations were different now, thoughtful, kind, and reflective. As they approached the same bench where Cain had been sitting weeks earlier, They were stunned to see him once again. There he sat, just as calm and composed as before, with the same old book resting on his lap. But this time, instead of being filled with misplaced confidence and a desire to prove something, the boys approached Cain with respect and gratitude. One of them, the same boy who had nearly raised his hand to strike Cain, stepped forward first. His tone was humble and genuine. "Sir, Cain," he began nervously. "We didn't expect to see you here again, but we're glad we did." Cain looked up from his book, a soft smile spreading across his face as he recognized the group. He set the book down on the bench beside him and met their eyes, nodding in acknowledgement. "I remember you boys," he said in his calm, wise voice. "How are you all doing?" The boys exchanged glances, and one of them spoke up. "We've changed a lot since that day. You taught us something we didn't even know we needed to learn. We just wanted to thank you for that." Cain's smile deepened, though his eyes remained as serene as ever. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "Sometimes life gives you a chance to see things from a different perspective. It's up to you what you do with that chance." The boys nodded, and one of them, his voice a bit hesitant, asked, "We've been talking a lot about what you said that day. About strength and wisdom and, well, we were wondering, would you show us a little bit of what you know? Some of those moves you were trained in?" Cain looked at them thoughtfully for a moment, his eyes studying their faces. It was clear they weren't asking out of arrogance or a desire to show off this time. There was genuine curiosity in their request, a desire to learn something meaningful. "I'm not a trainer anymore," Cain said, his tone gentle. "I've retired from all that. These days I only seek peace, but I can show you a little, just enough to help you understand what real strength is. But remember, what I show you isn't for fighting or hurting others. It's for discipline, for control, and for knowing yourself. You must never misuse what I teach." The boys agreed, nodding eagerly, understanding the gravity of his words. Cain stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and graceful. He led the boys to a small patch of grass nearby, away from the benches and the other park-goers. He then demonstrated a few simple hand movements, basic blocks, defensive stances, and calm breathing techniques. His movements were precise but fluid, like water flowing naturally. The boys watched in awe, trying to mimic his actions as best they could, though they knew they could never match his mastery. Cain smiled at their efforts. "It's not about how fast or powerful you are," he said, "but how much control you have over your mind and body. Strength without control is dangerous. Always remember that." The boys practiced the moves a little, but they understood that they were only being shown a glimpse of something much deeper. Cain's movements weren't just physical. They were an embodiment of years of discipline, wisdom, and understanding. The boys felt honored just to learn a small part of that. After a few minutes, Cain stopped, raising a hand to signal the end of their impromptu lesson. "That's enough for now," he said with a smile. "Like I said, I'm retired, and I'm not a teacher anymore. But you've learned enough to start understanding what real strength means, and remember, never use what you've learned to hurt others." The boys nodded eagerly, their faces glowing with both respect and gratitude. They felt humbled by the small demonstration, realizing that real strength was far more about control and character than physical power. "Thank you, Cain," one of the boys said earnestly. "We'll never forget what you taught us, both today and before." Cain smiled warmly and nodded. "Good. Now go and remember, life is about learning and growing. You have the power to change, and I believe you will." The boys bid Cain farewell, their hearts lighter and their minds filled with the lessons they had learned. As they walked away, they couldn't help but feel that they had been given something far more valuable than they had ever anticipated. 2 months passed since the day in the park, and the boys continued to grow in their newfound understanding of respect and humility. They actively sought opportunities to learn from others, listening to the stories of those around them. They volunteered at community centers, helped younger kids with their homework, and worked on projects that aimed to bring people together. The transformation in their behavior was noticeable, and the ripple effects began to touch many lives. One afternoon, while volunteering, the boys encountered a group of younger children who were struggling with their schoolwork. They were quick to jump in, offering their assistance with math problems and reading. The boys remembered how Cain had shared his wisdom, and they realized that teaching was just as rewarding as learning. As they helped the younger kids, they shared stories of their own mistakes, hoping to guide these children away from the paths they once walked. They spoke about the importance of kindness, understanding, and standing up against bullying. The younger kids listened intently, inspired by the sincerity and passion of the boys. Days turned into weeks, and the boys became known in their community for their positive attitude and willingness to help. They were no longer seen as the troublemakers they once were. Instead, they had become role models, embodying the lessons that Cain had instilled in them.